It's all falling apart, Danzō thought as he made his way to the old root facility. With Itachi and Sasuke both taken out of the picture, and the allied forces having a way to permanently disable the Edo Tenseis, the tide had turned. The most powerful asset he had left was Kushina, and her fragment of the Ninetales. But he knew that alone wouldn't be enough. At most he could check 1 or 2 of the Kages, but not all 4 of them plus Haruno. Yet earlier he had been given access to a new Edo Tensei, someone who would surely have enough power to turn the battle into his favor. If I can control him, Danzō thought. Theoretically, the Edo Tensei's control was absolute, but could absolute control ever be exerted over absolute power? Please let me be able to control him. A coffin and sacrifice had both already been prepared. Several guards stood outside the room. For all the good they'll do. Danzō stood there in front of the coffin, paralyzed by fear and indecision. It wasn't until another messenger came to him informing of how badly his forces were faring outside, and that the second barrier had fallen, that he steeled his resolve. He made the necessary hand signs. Impure world resurrection. And a sort of heaviness descended on the room. Not killing intent or any kind of intent really. Just pure pressure. Not undirected though, but simply unknown and all the more frightening because of it. Danzō found he had trouble breathing. The coffin opened and the true Madara Uchiha stepped out of it. He glanced at the skin of his hands. Not how I expected to return. This is Tobirama's jutsu, isn't it? He looked at Danzō. You look familiar. I am the Hokage and I have brought you back to defend the Leaf Village. Madara seemed to find that sentence amusing. He narrowed his eyes at Danzō. Yes, I remember you. You're that little brat that used to follow Sarutobi Hiruzen around. The first class to ever enter the academy. Judging by how old you look, it's been 60 years? Silence! Danzō said, and enforced his order with the Edo Tensei. Madara raised an eyebrow, but did keep silent. I require you to destroy the forces attacking the Leaf Village, nothing else. In response, Madara made hand signs for the summoning jutsu. It did nothing. The Ninetales hasn't been sealed into the Gedomazu yet. What has Obito been doing all this time? It would help if you told me a little bit more about the situation, Madara said. We are at the terminus of the 4th Great Ninja War. The other nations have formed an alliance in a last attempt to stop Konoha from uniting the world. That answer caused Madara to chuckle. Hashirama, I never believed in your optimistic vision of peace, but it's truly impressive how wrong you turned out to be. Have the tailed beasts been deployed in this war yet? Madara asked, fishing for how many Obito had gathered. That was a question that Danzō didn't feel Madara needed to know the answer to. You are wasting time. We need you on the battlefield. Madara felt a compulsion to obey, and shattered it. He was well over the threshold of power you needed to brute force your way out of the technique's control. As soon as Danzō saw this, he made hand signs to undo the Edo Tensei. Madara saw this and copied Danzō's hand signs and wrestled control of his own summoning away from him. Madara moved forward, grabbed the horrified Danzō by the neck and slammed him against the wall. One of the root agents moved to try and free his Hokage, but Danzō was able to lift a hand to order the man to stop. There was no use throwing their lives away against this man. What is the status of the 9 Bijou? Madara asked, forcing eye contact between him and Danzō. There was no resisting the chakra invading his mind. He could do nothing but answer truthfully. 8 of them are captured by a terrorist organization known as the Akatsuki. Only the Eight-Tails is in Konoha's possession. If Obito has gotten the Nine-Tails, why can't I summon him? Madara wondered. How long ago was the Nine-Tails captured? A little over 2 weeks. Enough time to seal it, but he might want to wait until they get to Hachibi, I suppose. And where is the Eight-Tails? Right down the corridor, third door on the left, taking the stairs down to the lowest level. The 8 tails is kept there until we can find a new suitable Jinchuriki. Thank you, Madara said, and released the Hokage and calmly started to walk towards the 8 tails. Finding a new Jinchuriki will not be necessary. Danzō knew better than to try and stop him. What have I done? And so Madara simply took B's drugged up body and snuck out of the Leaf Village. Though sneak out wasn't really the right word for it. He simply ran out of the village in a straight line, moving too fast for anybody to even register who he was, let alone try and stop him. Sakura did her best to avoid any direct fighting for herself. While she could fight on the level of the Kages, the issue was that she couldn't do it for very long. That spat with the Uchiha brothers had required her to use her inner lotus almost constantly, and stamina had never been her strong suit. Instead, she fully became the commander. Every squad in her army had a small copy of Katsuyu, and through them she could tell what was going on everywhere. Hundreds of fights were happening at the same time, and through her mental enhancements, she could pay attention to each one. Sakura's main job became figuring out which people in their army were best suited to fight which opponents. Like sending masters of the hidden Misjutsu up against any remaining revived Uchiha, sending long-range forces to counter some Hyuga, both dead and alive, sending ninjutsu users with the right elemental advantages against their counterparts. Back in the academy, many of her classmates had looked down on the more academic aspects of their education. Basically anything that didn't directly translate into learning to use chakra, use weapons, and physical education. The finer points of history, for example, couldn't hold the interests of many children. Yet these included the feats and abilities of many of the Leaf Village's old heroes. Sakura recognized many of them, and knew how they were defeated in life, and she could give that information to whoever they were fighting, and help devise counter-strategies, relaying the information through Katsuyu. Time tended to move fast for commanders, and most were forced to make split-second decisions. Sakura, with her slowing down her own sense of time, could take all the time she wanted to think of the proper responses. It wasn't just the undead they were fighting either. With the Leaf Village itself under threat, many alive Leaf Shinobi, some of whom she knew, had come out to defend their homes. Whenever possible, Sakura had members from her own organization, true disciples of Naruto, face them, hoping they could be talked down. They weren't here to kill anybody, just stop Danzō. They had limited success, but they did have some success. The fact that her army now had Orochimaru fighting for them wasn't helping to convince anyone they weren't the bad guys. Nor was the fact that Sakura's forces truly were destroying the Leaf Village down to the bedrock. Everything except the people. It made Sakura's throat clench up painfully to give the orders, but the Leaf's forces were using every building as a terrain advantage. This was urban warfare, and it heavily favored Danzō's native forces. The only thing Sakura could do to negate that was to order every single building in their way leveled down to the ground. Thankfully, all the civilians had been evacuated. Sakura had no idea what she would have decided if they weren't. The point was that this was yet another thing that prevented them from convincing anybody they weren't here to destroy their homes. Because they were blatantly destroying their homes. Except not really, since buildings could be rebuilt, but people couldn't. Very few were willing to surrender to them. From a young age, every ninja is told what horrible fate awaited anybody foolish enough to allow themselves that fate. It wasn't true in this case, but the fear persisted. Sakura allowed any living combatants that wished to flee the battle into the surrounding forests, or even retreat further inwards towards the center of the village. She knew that last option was a poor tactical choice, but it felt like the only one she could make. Furthermore, she directed resources to occupy some of the truly high-tier forces the Leaf still had at their disposal, Kushina chief among them. Being a seals expert, she had ways to undo the sealing tags Orochimaru had given them. Sakura directed the Raikage to occupy the woman. There were others. Might Dai, Gai's father, whose taijutsu was unmatched by anyone else on the battlefield. The previous generation of Ino Chikacho, the one before Ino's father's generation even, the original founders of that tactic. Isashi Hyuga, the old Sound 5 whose corpses Sakura herself had delivered to Konoha more than 3 years ago. All of these were obstacles, but nothing they couldn't ultimately overcome. A part of Sakura had hoped and dreaded in equal measure to find a resurrected Ino somewhere on the battlefield, but it appeared it wasn't to be. Sakura told herself she should be glad about that. Ino hadn't been much more than an average genin when she died, so it indeed wouldn't make much sense for her to be brought back for a combat potential. As for the psychological reasons, Ino had barely been a teenager, and by now Sakura was a young woman. An inexperienced child wouldn't be able to convince the woman Sakura had become to stray from the path she was now on. Danzō had probably realized this. All the same, Sakura had been mentally preparing herself for it, just in case Danzō proved to be that much of a dick. So far, the only time Sakura felt the need to personally handle any fights in Sasuke and Itachi was when Konohamaru was spotted, and it was clear he wouldn't be talked down. Naruto had been very fond of the boy, so Sakura felt she owed it to her memory to make sure he didn't get himself killed. Konohamaru attempted to hit her with a bow staff, no doubt inspired by his grandfather, but Sakura ducked under the blow and simply knocked him out with a melee genjutsu. She took down his two teammates with similar ease. Sakura ordered the trio to be removed from the battlefield and kept on their guard. All their works were becoming undone. Kushina thought that she was again forced to retreat from yet another street. She did not understand the broader context of this war, how it started, how it unfolded except near the end. All she understood was that the village she and her husband had sacrificed so much for was falling. Believing her daughter dead, all that was left was a desire to avenge her, and her duty as a Konoha ninja. Even death hadn't invalidated those oaths. She had to protect the Hidden Leaf Village. Yet even with a portion of the Nine-Tails' power, she lacked the strength to overwhelm even one of the Kages. She could take one or perhaps two, but that was all. Kushina did know of a sure way to turn the tides in their favor though. It involved a hidden temple on the outskirts of Konoha that belonged to her family, a place she had visited the day prior. As far as she knew, she was the only person aware of its existence. Her reluctance to use it had been born out of a desire to save her husband some pain, but he had loved the Leaf Village, and she believed he wouldn't look favorably on her letting it fall if there was still something she could do about it. She made a shadow clone and handed it a mask resembling the face of a Shinigami which she pulled out of a storage scroll. The shadow clone hurried to the Hokage to inform him, while Kushina would do her best to delay the enemy's advance for a little while longer. They hadn't heard back from Sasuke, but considering that there was still no sign of Itachi, Sakura figured he was doing a good job of keeping him busy. Regardless, their end goal was in sight. The last barrier, which held the Hokage's administrative building and the Ninja Academy. All the allied Kage were with her. What remained of Danzō's undead forces were gathered around Kushina, who served as a rallying point. Sakura felt strange upon seeing her. This was Naruto's mother. She felt that there should be some sort of connection between them. There you are. Finally. The current Hokage is an old man, so I can understand his reluctance to joining the fight until his back is against the wall. But you? If you're going to send men to die to destroy our home, you should at least risk yourself. I expected more from the one who was supposedly a friend of my daughter's. But there wasn't. Kushina didn't know Sakura. Logically speaking, she hadn't even known her own daughter. All she knew was what Danzō and those around her had told her. My tactics aside, what do you actually know about your daughter? Had she lived, would you be fighting to kill her now as well? I would have talked some sense into her! To forsake one's country and one's village is the same as forsaking one's child. Minato told me that before he died. I do not know what's happened with you and Naruto, but I can't understand it. I can't understand my child ever being the villain. You, on the other hand, you must have somehow led her astray. You don't really believe that. I never had Naruto's gift for seeing through people, but even I can see how you're grasping at straws. You know this attack only happened after the Leaf attacked and destroyed the homes of all the other villages. An attack you yourself were a part of. Sakura could see Kushina grinding her teeth in frustration. As for me leading Naruto astray, have a bit more faith in her, why don't you? Do you think she would have turned against the Leaf if it was still worth fighting for? Bringing up Naruto was a risk, and it didn't seem to have paid off. The guilt and doubt Sakura had briefly spotted on Kushina was buried by a sorrow it bordered on madness. Just shut up! What difference does it even matter anymore? Naruto was supposed to be the one to try and prevent catastrophe, not you or anyone! With her gone, all I can do is the best I can. She slammed a fist into her open palm for emphasis, making a large booming sound to illustrate the raw power she wielded. To keep beating up anyone before me until I'm faced with the ones who took her, and then I'll inflict such horrors upon them not even a piece of the Pure Land will be able to wipe away the scars upon their soul. Sakura opened her mouth to say something back, but the Raikage put a hand on her shoulder. This woman has clearly lost her reason. Do not waste your breath. Together we can put her down and finally put an end to all this. Sakura sighed. What I do here, I do in your daughter's memory. Before they could engage, however, Orochimaru, who had joined for the final push, froze up. What's wrong? Orochimaru lifted his hands and stared at them. My arms, they have been restored. Sakura had mixed feelings about Orochimaru being empowered by regaining the ability to use hand signs, but for right now she'd be grateful an ally had become stronger. She said so. No, you don't understand, Orochimaru said. My arms were sealed in the belly of the Shinigami. If they have been returned to me, then it is likely all others... And he was interrupted by movement. There was something in the corner of her eye, a flash of metal, a yellow light. When she turned to look, all she saw was one of her attendants falling, blood gushing forth from his neck. I have managed to delay you for long enough, Kushina said triumphantly. There was another flash, and two ninjas wearing Stone Village headbands dropped just like the previous one. All of them were on high alert, but Onoki's reaction was the most pronounced as all the color drained from his face. He levitated himself off the ground and shouted, Everyone run! Flee! Flee for your lives! Compose yourself, Lord Tsuchikage! Sakura snapped at him, even as all the stone ninjas didn't hesitate to do exactly as Onoki had asked. You don't understand, girl! Onoki said to her, and Sakura saw genuine terror on his face. Everyone not at the elite Jonin level or higher needs to leave immediately! There was a flash above them. When they looked up, there was nothing there. Though Sakura, having the fastest reaction speed out of all of them, did see several kunai moving at high speed from where the flash had originated. She traced the kunai's paths. There was another flash, and she caught her first glimpse of the man. A mop of yellow hair. A white coat with a flame-like motif at the ends. Sakura didn't have a Byakugan, and couldn't keep track of every kunai she had seen leaving from that flash above them. But from each she did see, he appeared for the smallest instant. So close together in time it appeared to the untrained eye as if he was in multiple places at once. From each location new kunai were launched, this time directly at each of the Kages, Sakura and Orochimaru. Sakura had seen what was happening. The Raikage was just plain fast enough to keep up. Orochimaru and Onoki had simply predicted what was going to happen. Gaara and Zabuza had to be pulled out of the way by Sakura and the Raikage respectively. And by pulled out of the way, that just referred to them not dying from a kunai to the throat like the previous casualties. Instead, Minato appeared in the middle of the leadership of this invasion, with everyone jumping away from him as if the man was a giant explosion. Except a regular explosion they'd been able to outrun. With a Rasengan in each hand, he struck at both Gaara and Zabuza. Gaara caught a Rasengan with his artificial right arm, which disintegrated. If he hadn't already lost that arm in his battle against Sasuke, he now would have. As it was, he could easily reform the limb. Zabuza managed to get his blade between him and the attack. It saved his life, but the blade was sent flying from his hands with such force it snapped his wrist. Minato, Kushina said in obvious relief. Seeing him made her feel, for a moment, that everything would be alright. That was until her husband turned to look back at her, and she saw disappointment in his expression. You should not have allowed for me to be brought back, love. Minato was, in some ways, better and worse informed than Kushina. He hadn't been brought back for more than a minute, unlike Kushina who said at least a week to take stock of the situation. However, I'm going to rule that this version of him is aware of the brief conversation he'd had with Naruto 3 years ago inside her seal. He had a decent understanding of the political situation at the time, since he could observe the world through her for 13 years. Then, having the first bit of new information being that Danzō was now Hokage and in charge of an undead army, then learning that Naruto's childhood friend was leading an army to the gates of Konoha. Minato was an extremely intelligent man. He could put the pieces together and realize that he wasn't fighting for a cause he should support, regardless of what oaths to protect Konoha he had taken in the past. Now, you might wonder, shouldn't Kushina also have realized this? Perhaps, but there is a reason that Minato became the Hokage and not Kushina, despite the latter having that as her dream when she was a kid. Minato is just a lot smarter than his wife. She's not dumb, far from it, but she's not at her husband's level, and extremely emotionally distraught. Speaking of which, you don't understand. Naruto, our baby, she's... Kushina couldn't even finish the sentence. Dead? Minato said, wide-eyed, and looking as horrified as one would expect. He turned to look at Sakura. Is this true? She was taken by the Akatsuki. Did you see her die? Did you bury her corpse? Minato read the answer in Sakura's expression. Then she isn't dead. I refuse to believe it until I see her body with my own eyes. You truly think? Kushina spoke. It is a parent's job to believe in their children. I believe, even now. Minato grimaced as he gripped one of his kunai. And when I see her, I do not relish the idea of telling her we killed her sister in all but blood. Kill. That had been Danzō's command to Minato. Kill them all. About a minute ago, Danzō hadn't dared to bring back Hashirama as well. If Madara had the brute force required to break free of his control, the same would be true for the first Hokage. And Danzō knew enough about his personality to know that he'd never support him, not even to save the village he helped create. Whether to bring back Tobirama had been a much harder decision. Ultimately, Danzō had decided against it. While not at the level of his brother, Tobirama had created the Edo Tensei. If anyone knew of another method to break free, it was him. Of course, Danzō didn't know whether he would turn against him or not. And that uncertainty hurt. Tobirama had been Danzō's sensei, the man whose ideals he had adopted, and yet, Danzō knew he had taken things far farther than Tobirama ever had, and in likelihood, ever would have condoned. Tobirama hadn't fully shared Hashirama's vision, but he had chosen to support it in his own way, and Danzō knew he had trampled over that vision. To bring back Tobirama only to have him declare that Danzō was the true problem that needed to be removed? The very idea of it was more than Danzō could bear. Luckily, he didn't need to bring back any of the Senju brothers to salvage this battle. Minato by himself would likely be enough, though he had also brought back Hiruzen back just to be safe. When the third and fourth Hokage stepped out of their coffins, Danzō hadn't wasted any time and immediately ordered Minato to go out and destroy the enemy, not leaving any room for discussion. With Hiruzen, Danzō allowed them a moment to take each other's measure. For the man whom Danzō had measured himself against for all his life, such a thing was owed. Hiruzen didn't speak to Danzō initially. Instead, he moved towards the window. They were at the Hokage's office, and he just stared at the Leaf Village in ruins. Nothing but one last barrier seal and undead forces, most lacking any sort of free will left to defend it, and opposing it, forces from the entire known world. What have you done, Danzō? What I've always tried to do. Put Konoha first. Don't say it, I do not need you to remind me how much I have failed. Tell me there is still something left. Tell me that most of our forces are out in the country, far away from here. Tell me that the civilians have been evacuated. They have been evacuated, and far more forces than needed, indeed, that I wish to, are defending them. Many have refused to help me defend our home. How many? And Danzō told him. For Hiruzen, it was still a depressingly low number. And everyone else, all dead. No, Danzō says. Many are also out there, attacking us. And what of Sasuke, Naruto and our friends? The children who are our future? What of Kakashi, Guy, my son Asuma? Please tell me that they all turned traitor. A sentence that Hiruzen never imagined he would speak. They did, and what few didn't have chosen to sit out this battle or are in prison. Then your failure isn't as complete as I had feared. While they live, there is hope. Danzō, you old fool. Even you must realize it by now. Whatever good intentions you had for Konoha have failed. Do you honestly think it's best for Konoha for you to be victorious at this point? I don't know, Danzō said honestly. But I've gone too far to turn back now. And he gave his old rival the command to join the battle outside. You have always done what you believed was best for Konoha. For all your flaws, I have never doubted that, or thought you did what you did for selfish gains. Hiruzen said as he turned his back to him. Even now, I still believe you have it in you to do what is truly best for our home. It is never too late to try and fix one's mistakes. And Hiruzen's body flickered away, leaving Danzō to collapse in Hokage's chair and bury his face into his hands. Ever since Hashirama had founded Konoha, it had had a reputation of being the strongest. Several villages teaming up to destroy them had always been a real possibility. Much of Hiruzen's work as the Hokage that had reigned for the longest time was based on making sure that scenario didn't happen. Heck, that was partially why Hiruzen had kept Danzō around despite everything. The man had had an unmatched talent for sabotaging diplomacy between the other villages. Hiruzen landed next to Minato and stared at the united four Kage, being led by what had once been one of Konoha's most promising youths. Danzō, you utter failure. The expressions on the faces of those whom Hiruzen was forced to take as enemies couldn't get much more grim after Minato had showed up. But he could still almost see them thinking about how low their odds of success became with Hiruzen now joining the fight. The only one who looked happy to see him was his old student. Never thought I'd see you again, Saratobi-sensei, Orochimaru said with a smirk. Already Hiruzen was looking forward to several snide remarks about what had become of his beloved village. And I am surprised to see you standing against Danzō, Orochimaru-kun. This seems unusually altruistic of you. Orochimaru's smirk dimmed, as if I'd pass up the chance to see Konoha burn to the ground. He was lying, and Hiruzen could tell he was lying, and Orochimaru was usually such a very good liar too. Something had happened to unsettle him. As I'm forced to fight, let me take this chance to take you to school one last time, Hiruzen said amicably. If he was going to fight anyone here, he'd choose this at least. Wouldn't have it any other way. And Hiruzen was further intrigued as Orochimaru waited until he received a nod from Haruno before engaging. Interesting. This left Minato and Kushina. You few before me are the only ones who can offer any meaningful resistance. You will not thank me for this, but the best I can do is to choose to kill you last. A kunai was thrown upwards. From the speed of the metal moving through the air, it was clearly being augmented by wind chakra. A yellow flash in the sky. Then so many kunai were launched from that one aerial position that it had to be based on some form of the shadow clone jutsu. They were so numerous they were blocking the view of the stars in the sky. Killing our entire army would take him minutes if that. Sakura realized with horror. She had never seen this man in action, but his feats were legendary. Then another man rose above the ground. Not this time, Onoki said. And what followed was the single most impressive showing of the particle style in all of recorded history. It started as usual as a small cube in his hands, but it rapidly expanded outwards, covering the entire battlefield in the form of a wide and broad but very thin sheet of translucent white energy. Most of the kunai that Minato launched puffed into smoke, showing that they were but chakra constructs. But not all. Some of the kunais, the original ones Minato had copied, were real, and those weren't stopped. While Onoki's particle style could destroy metal, by stretching the technique as far and wide as he had, it had also weakened it. The true steel passed through unharmed, though they were knocked slightly off course. Flashes of light in the distance, screams, the order to retreat, no, flee, being spread far and wide. Onoki was falling, having exhausted himself with that one technique. Sakura caught him, but she could do little for him except soothe his overworked chakra pathways. There was no easy fix for overextending your chakra like that. This is why he was feared, A said. Ordinarily, when truly powerful shinobi meet the champions on the battlefield, they fight the other champions, while regular forces seek to obtain other strategic objectives while the giants are occupied. Namikaze broke that tradition. Instead of fighting the other champions, he simply shredded the armies around him. Any attempt at opposing elites to face him went ignored. With his speed and teleportation, he could not be forced into a confrontation he didn't want. And only when you stand alone, all your friends and comrades slain around you, when your spirit is broken due to grief and despair, would Namikaze bother to put you out of your misery as well? Sakura looked down at Onoki. The stone village had hated Minato the most, and now Sakura understood why. She understood Onoki's reaction upon seeing him. When she had first learned of Naruto's parentage, she had thought the Turtle Kage had been overly paranoid by hiding it for so many years. Now, feeling that same sense of hopelessness as people who had followed her died all around her, Sakura understood why the thought of that happening again could drive some people to end his legacy in hopes of never having to see his like again. Minato wasn't the strongest ninja ever. Both Hashirama and Madara were beyond him. He wasn't the most ingenious. Tobirama had invented some of the most overpowered jutsu in history. Minato was one of the fastest ninjas ever, though there were a handful who could match him. But what Minato Namikaze was simply the most efficient killer in all of recorded history. All of Sakura's instincts were screaming at her to run back towards her forces, towards the flashing yellow lights, each signaling another death, and try to protect them somehow. She knew those instincts were wrong. With her self-hypnosis giving her precious time to think of the best possible solution, she went forward, not backwards, towards the last barrier protecting the center of the Hidden Leaf village, and Danzō. Her strongest allies charged with her. The only way to protect anyone was to force Minato into fighting them and not anyone else, and so they had to threaten the last barrier. The plan had been to use the remaining Chunin and below level ninjas to break it, but those were now unavailable, fleeing for their lives. Breaking it themselves would exhaust the Kage and Sakura, and leave them weakened when Minato would come to stop them. It wouldn't work. They couldn't afford to be anything but their best when fighting Minato. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Sakura fought in anger and frustration. She made the necessary hand signs. Byakugo Seal, release! Having been the faster of them, Ei had naturally overtaken her and taken points. He was then surprised when he saw Sakura again catching up to him, matching his speed, surpassing it even. She had the same markings covering her body that he'd only seen on her once before, back when she had overwhelmed him during their arm wrestling contest. I am sorry about this, Kushina said as she interposed herself. She had faith in Minato and his words was enough to convince her she was on the wrong side, but she didn't have the liberty to not oppose them. Kushina, with all the power the fragment of the Ninetales inside of her granted her, caught Sakura's punch in her open palm. The earth beneath their feet shattered from the clash. Sakura then caught Kushina's punch in her palm as well, and then they were just pushing against each other. Hands occupied, Sakura couldn't use hand signs, but Kushina, as a more or less perfect Jinchuriki, had more options available. She opened her mouth and began gathering energy to launch a tail beast bomb at near point-blank range. Sakura tried to throw her off, but Kushina was gripping on tightly. Chakra arms exploded from her to also keep the other Kages at bay. Just as Sakura was wondering if her healing factor could save her from a tail beast bomb, she and Kushina both noticed a glowing green light coming from Sakura's necklace. The necklace Tsunade had bestowed upon Sakura in her will. Kushina recognized it. The necklace of the first Hokage, an artifact specifically designed to suppress a tail beast's power. She felt a brief moment of panic before realizing that she actually wanted to lose this fight. Beams of green light exploded from the necklace, surrounding Kushina, squeezing her and draining her strength. With that, Sakura was able to overwhelm the other woman, throw her hands to the side and slam one of Orochimaru's anti-zombie seals on the older woman's forehead. Kushina was a seals master herself though, in that she could form them without the use of ink, and that gave her some means of resisting it. She still had the power that she gathered for the tail beast bomb, and she converted that energy to form a seal on her forehead that was the inverse of the suppression seal. It was sloppy work, made in a hurry, but it resulted in her undead body being blown to bits instead of being undone entirely. This was something that she could recover from given time. Moving on towards the barrier, Sakura punched the glowing red energy field with all the force she could muster. The energy required to break it was the equivalent of something like the Eight Tails. The plan had been for a large section of the army to pool their energies together for it. Now Sakura was doing it solo. Cracks appeared from her point of impact to eventually crumble with the sound of shattering glass. Ei, Onoki and Gaara all looked at her strangely. You weren't as strong before. They had recognized her worth as an equal, but this was something beyond that. a strength more in line with the true legends of history. Before she even had a chance to answer, Minato appeared before them. At least he had succeeded to stop his slaughter by forcing him to come deal with them. "Truly impressive," he said. "This power was not meant for you," Sakura said angrily. The Byakugo seal was her final trump card, the results of her storing her chakra for 3 years into her forehead. The workaround that would allow someone like Sakura, without naturally massive chakra reserves, to fight on par with the likes of Madara. With every second she used it, she was burning up several days worth of chakra being stored away. It was doubtful she'd have enough left to use it again after today, not unless she was given another few years to store up chakra. It was a power she had held back for the masked man. According to Naruto, who got her information from the man now standing as her enemy, he was the biggest threat to the world. Defeating him was supposed to have been Naruto's destiny, but her will had been passed on to Sakura. Yet it was clear nothing less than this would allow her to stand against someone like the fourth Hokage. Even if Sakura won this, she feared what would happen in the future. There would likely be other battles that she'd now be unprepared for, but she banished those thoughts from her mind, one crisis at a time. "I really should have paid more attention to Tsunade's research. I sense that your chakra capacity currently exceeds mine own," Minato said. Minato's abilities were well documented, and he wasn't known as a censor, and he'd need to be to make that assessment. Then Sakura noticed something else, how he was standing perfectly still when he wasn't talking, with the only movement coming from his cape and hair moving with the wind. "Oh no," Sakura thought, and her fears were confirmed a moment later when sage markings appeared on his face. "As if you needed to be any more bullshit," A complained. "When did you learn that?" "I only knew some vague theories back when I was alive, but 3 years ago the first Hokage's soul was sealed inside the Shimigami with me. I learned a lot from him. This is actually my first time using this form." And that, folks, is my explanation for why he never used Sage Mode while he was alive. The man learned it while being dead, talking to Hashirama inside the Reaper. It can't be true in canon, since Hashirama didn't recognize Minato when he was revived, but I'm still going with this. It just makes sense. Next, Minato moved. It wasn't even teleporting, but pure speed, exceeding the Raikages, exceeding what even Sakura was now capable of. Sakura braced herself, but true to form he went after the weakest link first. Gaara couldn't do much but hide inside a dome of sand, hoping to weather the storm. A's lightning cloak allowed him to at least survive the first Rasengan slammed into his back. Onoki hit underground, which was actually the most effective counter of them all. Minato was not, and still isn't, a user of Earth Jutsus. Sakura was the only one who actually managed to fight back. It felt surreal, a dance of punches, blocks and kicks with one of the greatest legends in history. With the power currently coursing through her, she felt like a goddess. Like she could bench press a mountain without effort. She figured this was how Naruto must have felt all the time. But her opponent was just as, if not more impressive. He was faster and stronger than her still, but Sakura still had her mental enhancements going for her. That which allowed her a sort of precognition on par with the Sharingan. That was how she was surviving, by always being 2 steps ahead of her opponent. When he began tossing kunais in the air, she predicted where he was going to appear by where his eyes looked. She never lost track of any of the kunais that Minato threw. When he began to guide her towards a spot so that one of the kunais that he once threw into the air would fall past her blind spot, Sakura allowed it. When the time was right, Sakura unsealed the kunai attached to one of the zombie suppressing seals, palmed it so Minato didn't notice. She threw it backwards, keeping its short trajectory out of Minato's line of sight, and when he teleported to attack her, the seal was inside of him. He froze up and started to fall. And if Minato had been alone, that would have been the end of it. Yet Kushina had reformed by this point, saw the predicament her husband was in, and a chain of chakra pierced through Minato's chest, pushing out the little seal. This is madness, Sakura thought. Having to fight both Minato and the perfect Jinchuriki at the same time? What she was doing was even crazier than anything Naruto had ever done, including her fight against Pain. If any of the other Kages tried to intervene, Minato would make swift work of them, and if they'd escape with their lives for the attempt, they'd be lucky. At this point, both Sakura and he were just in a tier of ability above them. Instead, the other Kage went after Kushina, at least making sure that Sakura didn't have to worry about her as well. Sakura didn't have any attention to spare for that fight. She could only trust in her allies as Minato required her full attention. When Minato again tried to teleport, Sakura misread the kunai he was going to go to. His eyes spoke one story, but Minato had seen how she used his eyes to read his moves, and thus fooled her. That mistake ended with a Rasengan to her shoulder. She was no Edo Tensei with infinite regeneration, but her strength of 100 healing regeneration was almost as good. She didn't stay down for more than 2 seconds, yet Minato's attack had done something else. By landing just one hit, he had been able to mark her skin, allowing him to teleport within range of her whenever it pleased him. Where some would see an insurmountable disadvantage, Sakura just saw another opportunity, as this was yet another method of attack she'd be able to predict. She didn't know the when, but she now knew the where. She summoned Genjutsu images all around her of 2 types. One obvious, pink Sakura blossom petals leaves flying around her. Minato blasted her with wind chakra to test the jutsu. The images weren't affected by the wind, but Sakura allowed the petals to disappear, so pretending that they did. The second type of images she summoned were nothing but small specks of dust, camouflaged to look like their surroundings. Those she kept around. And so when Minato teleported to that spot, he was paralyzed by the genjutsu she had prepared. In that moment, she again slapped one of the seals on him, only to see that Minato exploded in a puff of smoke, the telltale sign of a shadow clone jutsu. Sakura's supernatural reflexes saved her when she saw a yellow flash out of the corner of her eye. She managed to dodge out of the way of the Rasengan, which would have taken off her head. Dodging wasn't ideal as it left her on the defensive, but she just had no technique that could safely block the strength of a Sage Mode fueled Rasengan. I've rarely had to fight someone with such caution before, Minato praised, but Sakura was focusing too hard on staying alive to enjoy it. Yes, she had gotten some good hits in, but Sakura knew with every failed attempt her chances of victory went down. She only had so many tricks and each would only work once. His Sage Mode, it has to run out eventually, Sakura thought as Minato teleported to a kunai behind her. The man's taijutsu was something to behold. He always had a kunai in at least one hand and managed to throw it in the same movement of some other taijutsu move. Sakura blocked his fists. A second before, he released the kunai, letting simple momentum carry it behind her back. Then he would appear behind her, leaving her off-balanced and facing the wrong way. Sakura tumbled forward and managed to weave hand signs before she hit the ground. The only way for her jutsus to work was if he didn't see them coming, so these moments where he was behind her and couldn't see her hands were her only chance to make her moves. Again she summoned Genjutsu images, camouflaged them as more dust that was thrown up by Sakura rolling over the ground. Minato stepped into it and again it paralyzed him briefly. It was a crude form of Genjutsu. She'd much preferred to trick his senses with some falsity, but Sakura was well aware of what Sage Mode could do. It turned the user into a powerful sensor, and Sakura didn't feel confident that she'd be able to fool those senses. Her trick put momentum back in her corner. She still had a few Genjutsu images left over and she instructed them to stick close to any kunai Minato released from his hand. He'd be unable to move to any of them without being paralyzed for at least a brief second. The problem, Sakura discovered, was that he already had plenty of teleportation marks all over the village, some of whom he had placed literal decades before while alive, just because he could and it was convenient to be able to teleport all over his village. And Sakura couldn't keep track of or look for all of those marks. At one point when Minato touched her arm, he teleported both himself and her to a new location. Sakura would have been disoriented if it wasn't for her self-hypnosis rapidly allowing her to take stock of her new surroundings. They were still in Konoha and close to where they were before. She planned to keep pressing her advantage until she heard Ace shout, "Behind you!" She turned her neck just in time to see one of Kushina's tail beast bombs sailing towards her. In desperation, Sakura turned and punched the incoming explosion. Sakura's world narrowed down to pain, an inability to breathe like being punched in the chest. A booming sound, a brief light until she turned blind. When it was over, the world was still except for a ringing sound in her ear. Sakura knew she must look like a burned corpse. The strength of 100 healing jutsu had allowed her to survive the small nuke exploding in her face, but she knew it was over. Her sense of light and sound were slowly returning to her as her body repaired itself, but she just didn't have anything left. All her remaining chakra had been used to survive the explosion. There were no more Byakugo markings on her skin. 3 years of meticulously storing away her chakra. All that power. She had used it up in a matter of minutes. On the ground she saw green shards, the remains of the first Hokage's necklace. It had completely used itself up to mitigate some of the damage. Without it, she'd surely be dead. She had attempted to separate Minato from Kushina, but only now did she realize the futility of that. How could you separate one person from another if one could teleport? And they were husband and wife. They had known each other for a lifetime. They both came from the hidden village that most emphasized teamwork. She and Akages hadn't even known each other for a month. This outcome, it now seemed inevitable. Minato was slowly walking towards her, a kunai held in a trembling hand, its features contorted into a horrified grimace. He's fighting the control of the Edo Tensei, and failing, Sakura realized. Minato was powerful, no two ways about it, but he wasn't Madara powerful. At his core he was a precision and not a power fighter, which made him the ideal puppet for a user of the Edo Tensei. A came in from Minato's back, but the fourth Hokage leaned out of the way without even looking at him, spun and slammed the Rasengan into his back. The big man's cloak of lightning dissipated and he didn't get back up. Some distance away she could see Gaara trying and failing to restrain Kushina by himself. I did all I could, Naruto. More than you or anyone else could have expected of me, Sakura thought. I can't stop it, Minato told her when he stood in front of her. Forgive me. Not your fault, Sakura said, smiling, and she discovered she wasn't afraid. I am tired, and I'll soon get to see her again. She tried to summon the last of her strength to stand up, to die on her feet like the image of the hero they'd all dreamed of becoming. But her body felt so heavy. She was so tired. And if she did stand up, she felt like she'd immediately be blown from her feet by the wind, which was picking up in intensity. We've been fighting the entire night, Sakura thought as she saw Minato's face, his handsome face slowly being illuminated by the rising of the sun. I didn't think it was that long. Sakura awaited for Minato to finish her off, but he was ignoring her for the moment, his gaze towards the rising sun. The light was strengthening faster than was normal. Sakura managed to get herself into a sitting position and turned to look as well. That's no sunrise. It looks like Kushina. No. Naruto! The moment the thought occurred to her, there was no doubt in her mind. A giant storm carried the light that was Naruto. Only now Sakura realized that the increasing winds also came from her. The light coming from her golden form turned night into day and made the glow emanating from Kushina appear dull by comparison. When she was above the village, Sakura again lowered herself to the ground to avoid being blown away. If the Leaf Village wasn't already mostly destroyed, Naruto's mere presence right now would have done it. Often the QB had been described as a living natural disaster, and Sakura had never understood that concept more than now. Making a sharp turn in the sky that would have crushed any normal object, Naruto rushed towards the ground like a comet. Right towards Sakura. Minato had to teleport away or be crushed. Sakura's body hurt as the ground trembled when Naruto landed. Sakura was even thrown a few feet into the air, but strong arms made of pure chakra grabbed and steadied her, shielding her from further injury. It was a QB's power but lacked its normal corrosive quality. Instead it just felt like an extension of Naruto's own warm chakra. Yo, Naruto said as if this was just an ordinary greeting on an ordinary day. She was crouching next to her, grinning widely. I kept my promise. Sakura made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She had to blink several times to get rid of the tears that had gathered in her eyes. Sakura felt like the light coming from Naruto should be blinding her, but it didn't. It was simply beautiful. The most beautiful thing Sakura had ever seen. The strong winds that had threatened to toss Sakura into the air were also lessened so close to Naruto, like the eye of the storm. I've been out of the loop. Could you tell me what's going on? Danzō raised the dead to conquer the world. We're trying to stop him, Sakura managed to say. Take charge again, tell me what I'm supposed to do. Sakura fought desperately. Naruto, your parents. Minato had teleported to Kushina's side. The former looking smug, the look of a man who had his every belief validated. Kushina just looked odd, mesmerized. Tears would follow if given enough time, there was no doubt. I see them, Sakura, Naruto said crisply, low and dangerous. Were they the one who hurt you? And instantly Sakura understood that whatever respect she might have had for her father and mother, she'd never forgive either of them if they had willingly harmed her. They didn't have a choice, Sakura was quick to assure her. Most of the revived ones don't. Naruto nodded and placed a hand on her shoulder. Sakura felt Naruto's chakra flowing through her body, revitalizing her. Chakra was the manifestation of physical and spiritual energy, and having Naruto's chakra touching her so intimately drove home the point that she was back like nothing else had. Sakura gasped and had to hold back another sob. Be stronger for a bit longer, Naruto whispered. Sakura nodded and began applying her self-hypnosis to process her emotions faster. Naruto, Gaara called out to her. Of all the Kages fighting for him, he was the one who was injured the least. I am not sure even you will be able to take those two out. Mostly because Naruto hadn't been instructed on how to use the Inotensi suppression seals. But do you think you can keep them busy while we move onward? You misunderstand, Gaara, Naruto said, and it lacked some of the bite in her tone whenever she normally spoke to him. I don't need to keep them busy. And Naruto raised a hand, and in it she gathered a large sphere of black chakra and pointed right at the Hokage's building. Sakura was no sensor, but she could feel the power it held. It was enough power to destroy the Hidden Leaf village by itself. They are the ones who need to keep me busy. Stop her! Minato and Kushina both heard Danzō's command in their heads, and they were forced to obey. Naruto allowed herself to be tackled by Kushina's Kurama avatar. After all, she also wanted to fight somewhere without risk of collateral damage. Minato tried to throw a Rasengan at Naruto's back, but a hand of chakra emerged from her and slammed its own Rasengan against his. The opposing rotating forces simply cancelled each other out. And thus the three most powerful individuals here left the immediate battlefield. Sakura stood up, her body no longer feeling heavy. It wasn't just Naruto's chakra revitalizing her. Sakura was someone who preferred to rely on her yin chakra, which leaned more towards the spiritual side of things. And her spirit, more than her physical body, felt like it was alive like it hadn't been in weeks. Before, Sakura fought out of a sense of duty and obligation. With Naruto back, she could fight not just for the future of others, but also for her own future, a happily ever after for herself. It renewed her enthusiasm like nothing else could. There was almost a spring in her step as she beckoned her allies forward. Gaara was there. He had also gotten back up. Zabuza had rejoined them, though he was leaning on Haku for support. Onoki was still out of it, but Kurosuchi had taken charge and was now representing the Hidden Stone Village. Let's go end this, Sakura said, and started walking towards the Hokage's tower. About a month ago, Sasuke believed he had caught up to his brother. His fight with Itachi in the Uchiha hideout had been his hardest fought battle to date, yet he had finally been able to fight his brother on a more or less even footing. Even learning that Itachi had wanted to lose that fight had done nothing to dissuade Sasuke from believing that. Yet now, clashing with Itachi in the forest surrounding Konoha, Sasuke realized how arrogant he had been. The Edo Tensei was supposed to come with a slight nerf to one's base stats, but that paled to the handicap Itachi had had before with his terminal illness. Sasuke had reached the pinnacle of Uchiha power, the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, a power only Madara Uchiha himself had ever unlocked. Itachi was still stuck a level below that. Yet it was all Sasuke could do to keep up with him. He was stronger and faster than Itachi, barely, but Itachi had martial skills that even Sasuke couldn't match. The elder brother had an instinct and talent for battle that allowed him to not only read Sasuke's moves, something the Sharingan already allowed, but almost direct his moves. Sasuke was forced to recognize a truth he had always suspected. Itachi was simply a better and more talented shinobi than he was. If the playing field was even, he'd always win. Sasuke didn't dare call upon his allies at this juncture. He feared they'd be cut down in moments in the storm of fire and metal. The Yada mirror could deflect anything Sasuke could throw at him, including his own Susanoo arrows. Sasuke had no such protection against the Totsuka blaze, and it was a constant dance with disaster to maneuver around it. The good news was that he didn't actually need to win. He wanted to. By God did he want to punch Itachi's face in, but the world didn't rely on him doing so. All he needed to do was stall him for long enough for Sakura and her allies to do what they needed to do. Itachi seemed willing to play along, not really escalating the fight as far as they could to draw things out. Eventually, the reason for that became apparent. Itachi couldn't get tires. So long as the fight continued, the greater Itachi's advantage would become. He'd already bought Sakura a lot of time, but if this dragged on much longer, the advantage would swing too much in Itachi's favor, and Sasuke would be unable to keep up with him. If Sasuke wanted any kind of chance to not lose, let alone win this battle, he had to act soon. The fire from the ninjutsus both Sasuke and Itachi had been using had again set up the necessary conditions. No doubt Itachi knew what he was planning, but he wasn't stopping it. Why would he? It hadn't worked before. Thunder rumbled above them. Itachi held up the Yada mirror in warning, or taunt. "Karin!" Sasuke declared. He had grown stronger since he used it last, and he was able to focus the power better. It took the form of a spear descending from the heavens. Not as impressive looking as a dragon, but arguably more deadly with the increased piercing power. Yet for all that, it wasn't enough. "It's pointless, Sasuke. Even you can't overwhelm the Yada mirror." Sasuke didn't respond to Itachi's taunt. "Sarutobi!" Sasuke shouted. And thus the allies Sasuke had requested finally started to show themselves. "Fire style Dragon Fire Jutsu!" Asuma declared. The attack resembled a continuous stream of fire, and it too impacted the Yada mirror. "A single Jonin's worth of power won't make a difference, Sasuke," Itachi said. Yet despite that, it seemed that as soon as the fire joined the assault, Sasuke's Karin spear was starting to penetrate a bit deeper. "Kakashi!" Sasuke yelled, and then his first sensei appeared. Earth-style Earth Dragon Bullet! And the head of a small dragon appeared out of the ground and began shooting balls of mud at the Yada mirror. Kakashi's power also shouldn't have made a big difference, yet the Yada mirror began to vibrate. Itachi could sense that the shield was being damaged. "I see," Itachi thought. "Very clever." The Yada mirror was a perfect shield to counter ninjutsu. If you threw a lightning dragon at it, it would counter with wind chakra. If you used fire, it would gravitate towards becoming water aligned. And so the shield could counter attacks that were normally well above the user's weight class. Yet when it tried to bring its wind nature to counter Sasuke's Karin, that itself was only reinforcing Asuma's fire style. When it then also brought up water chakra, that was being suppressed by Kakashi's earth jutsu. Itachi knew what would happen next. Temari showed herself. With style Wind Scythe Jutsu! And a wind attack was added to the assault, suppressing the lightning affinity that the shield had tried to summon to counter Kakashi's earth style. Cracks had already started to appear. Suigetsu didn't need anybody to tell him it was his turn now. Water style, Water Dragon! And so the last of the elemental affinities was added to the assault. Let's end this, Hinata! Sasuke cried, and then she appeared, and she took over from Sasuke's Karin. Lightning exploded from her fingertips. Chidori Sharp Spear. And so freed Sasuke to do what he needed to do. Go! The team Sasuke had chosen said as one. He summoned the Susanoo around himself, summoned the Spirit Arrow, and fired. Earlier in the fight, the Yada mirror had proven to be a match for the attack. But now, with the sound of shattering glass, the so-called most powerful shield in the world shattered into a million translucent ethereal pieces. Itachi's torso was blown to bits, and then a copy of Kakashi was suddenly there to slap an Edo-Tensei's suppression seal on his forehead. I see, Itachi said, lying on the ground with the bottom half of his body missing. How fitting. who couldn't trust in anyone else to do what needed to be done, defeated by you trusting in your friends and allies. You've done well for yourself, Sasuke. You give me too much credit. I used to be no better than you in that regard. I tried very hard to push Hinata away, for example, but she stubbornly insisted to be part of my life, despite that it would have been easier not to. Sasuke scowled. Remember that the next time you think I chose poorly. I'm afraid, Sasuke, there will not be a next time. Itachi began to glow white as his body started to fall apart. Rejoice, your fool of a brother will no longer be able to interfere in your life. Whatever you choose now, even if you choose to destroy the hidden leaf in its entirety, you have my blessing and my love. Should you be the last the world will ever know of the Uchiha, I have no doubt our parents would have been pleased. Sasuke stood staring at the place where Itachi's essence had disappeared into the sky for a while. You still hate him? Hinata asked eventually. Almost as much as I find I still love him. In these last moments, Sasuke had discovered he could do both. How cruel, Kushina thought as she was facing her own daughter. Her relief that her baby yet lived had been cut short with the realization that she would now be forced to try and kill her herself. She could only pray that her daughter could somehow defeat both herself and Minato. An incredibly tall order, even for one as powerful as Naruto seemed to have become. While Kushina's face was contorted into a pained grimace, Naruto herself had a serene smile on her face. I truly am a big hypocrite, aren't I? I've been trying to create a more peaceful way of life like Jiraiya wanted. Yet I can't deny that I love the idea of fighting you both. This is no game, Naruto, Kushina snapped. We'll be trying to kill you. I am a Kunoichi, and I love being a Kunoichi, despite me realizing the problems in idealizing such a violent profession. I trained for this. Trained for it nearly every day. Being a warrior has defined my life. And forgive me, but I am proud of who I have become, what I have become capable of. If there is but a single thing I could share with the two of you, I am glad it is this. She wants to make us proud, Kushina realized. The thought filled her with warmth, and she realized she no longer dreaded the upcoming fight quite as much. It is their parents' job to believe in their child, Minato had said. I can do that, Kushina thought. Naruto, do you remember our last conversation? Minato asked. How could I ever forget? And you remember what I said you had to do? I had to become stronger than you, right? Naruto said, her smirk widening in anticipation. Then let this be our final exam, Minato said, returning her expression. Best of luck to you, sweetie. And with that, he threw several of his kunai in a wide arc. He himself charged with them, matching their speed perfectly. Even as Naruto clashed with her father, hands of chakra emerged from her form to knock the kunais out of the air. With Kurama's power, Minato couldn't match her in melee for long, but he had the luxury of being able to teleport himself to safety whenever he felt overwhelmed. When Naruto tried to pursue, her mother was there. Her chains a danger where Kurama's chakra were more a hindrance than a help. Your flying Raijin isn't a teleportation technique, Naruto said at one point. Minato smiled indulgently. He knew it was most certainly a teleportation technique. Then what else is it? It's a clone technique. Each of your marks is a place where you could be, and for all intents and purposes are. You are almost impossible to beat without destroying all of those marks first. Unfortunate for you then that I still got several marks all over the world. Yet I'm not trying to beat you, Naruto said as he used miniature tail beast bombs to destroy several of the kunais Minato had scattered about the battlefield. You are trying to beat me. Get too far away from me and I can defeat Mom. As if to emphasize her point, she moved around one of Kushina's chains with a speed the older woman couldn't match. Or go deal with the Hokage. Alright then, let's see you do it then. Let's see you avoid being checkmated by me, Minato said. He was clever and had already realized everything Naruto just told him, and had placed several marks on trees, the ground, and everywhere he got the chance to place one without Naruto noticing. There were two in particular that were important. One was on Kushina, so Naruto couldn't force him from the battlefield without dealing with his wife first. The second, and more important one, was on Naruto herself. A mark that he had placed on her when she had just been born. Even now, 16 years later, Minato could still feel it. He teleported behind her back. He didn't hit her with a Rasengan, as he doubted that would keep her down for long. Instead, he teleported the both of them to a gigantic seal Kushina had prepared somewhere in the forest. A seal based on her own chains, meant to suppress a Bijuu's power. Naruto's light dimmed and now Minato felt he could get the upper hand. Yet even now Naruto battered the kunai he threw away with her hair. And even when he infused a kunai with enough wind chakra to cut through her hair, Naruto was ready for him. When he teleported into her blind spot, he threw a Rasengan at her. The arm he used to do it with was cut off by a stream of wind chakra he hadn't seen. Incredible. Like the Rakage's lightning cloak but of wind, made for defense more of an offense. Minato's arm regenerated swiftly, yet it still left him vulnerable for a few seconds and Kushina had to jump in to protect him. When she entered her own large seal, her own tail beast's power were suppressed as well. But it was less of a handicap for her as Naruto's 9 tails was stronger. Kushina's mastery of sealing jutsu surpassed even Minato's and she flawlessly incorporated them into her taijutsu. Her mother relied on a lot of grappling techniques to prolong physical contact, allowing her to place more restrictive seals. Though this was again partially countered by Naruto's shield of wind chakra. But more importantly, this brought their chakras in very close proximity, allowing for Naruto's by now almost instinctive use of ninshu. It was known that when two powerful shinobis clashed, they were capable of understanding one another's thoughts simply through an exchange of blows. At no time had this ever been more evident than now. When Naruto's chakras met Kushina's attempt at sealing jutsu, she came to understand what the art of Funjitsu meant to her mother. A lonely child in a foreign village after the destruction of her home. Her seals were her method of connecting, remembering, and honoring all that she had lost. In Minato's chakra, honed to a fine edge, teleporting to and fro with his kunai and with his Hirashin marks, Naruto understood what that jutsu meant to her father. How in perfecting a technique that allowed him to be anywhere he needed to be, he could best protect those he cared for. As their fists met, Naruto saw images of her mother as a child being kidnapped, and Minato fearing he'd be too late to save her. If he could just teleport, he'd never fear being too late again. And it worked both ways as well, as Minato was denied delivering decisive blows by sharp wind chakra spinning around his daughter. Minato already knew Naruto knew the Rasengan, but it wasn't what she chose to rely on most. As he clashed with Naruto's chakra, he understood how she had for all intents and purposes been a clanless orphan, with no parents to pass on their techniques, and so she had developed her own, starting with her hair and a mastery over wind chakra that Minato couldn't hope to match. Even after Jiraiya had started tutoring her, nothing ever replaced that foundation that Naruto had built for herself. Both Minato and Kushina understood all of this as the blades of wind chakra cut at them. The cloak of wind chakra Naruto created had been created to counter the masked man's teleportation, to overcome the foe her father hadn't been able to, her wish to fulfill the expectation Minato had placed on her. This too Minato and Kushina understood, and they couldn't have been more proud. And so with each time they clashed, whether by fists, steel or ninjutsus, their chakras met and the family learned to understand each other a bit more. 16 years of having missed the chance to know their daughter, or her parents, was being condensed into one legendary duel. Minato threw kunai high up into the sky and managed to teleport both himself, Naruto and Kushina high up into the air. By continuously juggling kunai into the air, Minato could maneuver himself and his wife around in the sky. From this position, and Naruto not having any leverage to move, Kushina tried to ensnare her with her chains. Yet Naruto was far from helpless in the skies. Backed by Kurama's might, and having a mastery over wind chakra unheard of in history, Naruto was able to push against the winds, like the ultimate form of the tree and water walking technique, now being used on nothing but air, combined with simple propulsion of wind jutsus that Naruto had used to achieve a form of flight in the past. And so they danced around each other in the sky, Naruto and Kushina like two shining balls of light moving in a tornado of wind jutsus, like two suns orbiting one another, and Minato's flashes of Hirashin like twinkling stars surrounding them. Kushina's adamantine chains dueling with Naruto's hair appendages like silver and golden snakes trying to ensnare each other. Below them, whoever wasn't caught up in fighting couldn't keep their eyes off them. It was the most amazing thing many of them had ever seen. Danzō had thought it the cruelty to put father and mother against their daughter. Yet by now, the family of three couldn't think of this battle as anything but a blessing. In Naruto's more tactical mindset, Kushina found traces of Naruto's bond with Sakura, the friend who inspired and cultivated that mindset. In how Kushina and Minato seamlessly worked together, how their chakras flowed as one, being able to anticipate each other's needs, Naruto felt the trust and love they held for one another. When Naruto's KCM cloak moved without her say, they understood that the Ninetales inside of her wasn't just giving her his chakra, but that he was actively fighting alongside her. A being that Kushina in particular knew had held nothing but contempt for humanity, and so they understood Naruto's talents for making others believe in her. By now, all thoughts of the world around them had disappeared. Minato and Kushina still had the commands by Edo Tensei to try and deal with Naruto quickly and come to the Hokage's aid, but Naruto was up to the task of keeping them at bay. By now, it was no longer Danzō's orders guiding their actions, but an honest desire to show their child all that they could do. They all wished that this fight could go on forever, but eventually the war below them would be decided, and the world would remind the Uzumaki family that it existed. Under normal circumstances, a rematch between Orochimaru and Hiruzen Sarutobi would be the thing that demanded everybody's attention. Yet today it was just one of several things. This day had already shown so many displays of ability, courage and valor that Orochimaru and Hiruzen's fight had become but a mundane backdrop. They were left mostly to their own devices, and both combatants were grateful for it for different reasons.
40 years of working to protect this village. How does it feel, Sensei? To see that all your sacrifices were meaningless in the end.
The Hidden Leaf Village and the Will of Fire is an ideal, and an ideal isn't so easily destroyed. I still see it even now. A shinobi's strength comes not from Honjutsu, but from defending those precious to him. Orochimaru looked at Hiruzen with amusement.
A nice sentiment, but I believe those you trust to carry your legacy have evolved beyond that archaic notion.
He knew the ideal seekers had spoken out against the system of every village fighting only for their own precious people, believing that it would inevitably lead to conflict. Or something like that. Orochimaru didn't care to debate that point, however.
I will grant you I was wrong about one thing.
Oh, I could lecture for hours on all the things you are wrong about. What specifically are you referring to?
Do you recall our discussion at the Chunin exams? How those of common backgrounds will never be able to reach as high as those born into greatness? I have since been shown evidence to the contrary.
And is that why you are no longer seeking the body of an Uchiha? Hiruzen knew Danzō was likely Orochimaru's best chance of getting one, and he was fighting him.
Indeed. Now I question whether the Sage of Six Paths is truly the pinnacle of evolution. Whether I can reach beyond it even by simply perfecting myself.
Hiruzen knew that this admission, even if true, was far from an admission that he wished to redeem himself. Orochimaru was still dangerous, perhaps even more so in the long term. It made no sense for Hiruzen to be pleased by Orochimaru's new direction, yet he was. No doubt it was the old teacher in him. What of your experiments?
I don't know demand as I restrict myself to what they would consider humane tests,
Orochimaru said with contempt.
It will be a hassle and slow me down, but I have nothing if not time.
Orochimaru had no plans to relinquish his immortality anytime soon. Have you considered that if you are wrong about one thing, you might be wrong about other things too?
I am a scientist. I am always open to the idea that I am wrong about everything, but I'll need to be shown evidence to indicate such.
Hiruzen cursed himself for a fool, but he found he couldn't suppress the glimmer of hope that Orochimaru wasn't completely a lost cause. It didn't take long for Sakura, Gaara and Ei to recall their forces from their retreat. Their people weren't cowards, and they knew it was now or never. They were here to save their lands and people or die in the attempt, and never would have fled from Minato if their commanders hadn't ordered it, and they were now all too eager to return. By now they again had a small squadron, with more trickling in, enough to push forward again. Gaara suggested waiting for more, but A wasn't the most patient of men, and Sakura... Well, Sakura would admit to not being in her right mind right now. Naruto's arrival had pushed her into a state of euphoria, and convinced her that this day couldn't possibly end badly anymore. Surely destiny wouldn't have seen fit to return Naruto to them, only to snatch victory away from her. They were heading towards the Hokage's tower, towards what was likely to be the final battlefield, and Sakura did it with a small spring in her step. She'd use self-hypnosis to bring herself back to a state of rationality once they hit any more opposition, but for now she'd allow herself these feelings. Nearly all the Leaf's living forces had been huddled behind the last barrier, so there was still plenty of opportunity for resistance. Yet none looked eager to attack them, and continued to fall back, even onto the Hokage's building. It was there, on top of the roof, that they found Danzō. The man seemed in a trance almost, looking over the faces of the previous Hokages in the mountain, the destroyed Leaf village, sparing a glance towards the Leaf's forces and then towards Sakura and her allies. Generations of our people worked to build this place up, gave their lives to protect it, and now you and your friends managed to destroy it in a matter of hours. Quite a feat. Sakura wasn't impressed by the accusation. This is much more your fault than mine. It is, Danzō agreed readily. More than a single mistake led to this moment, and most of those were mine. Yet I don't think this is solely my fault either. It was possible, you know. If you and Uzumaki had remained loyal, we could have won honorably. I am old and would have soon passed my title to someone else, likely Uzumaki again. You two would have then had all the authority to change the world for the better. A united world. Sakura opened her mouth to argue further, but A said, "Why are we still talking? The bastard is standing right in front of us. Just attack him and have done." Sakura noticed that the Leaf's forces tensed at those words. They didn't want to fight, but they would if push came to shove. Loyalty to one's Kage ran deep for most, even if they didn't agree with him. In Sakura's best estimation though, her forces would win that fight. "I have a proposal," Danzō said. "I'm listening." "Single combat, you and me, no other living person need die." "Deal," Sakura said before anyone could convince her otherwise. She had already fought Itachi and Minato today, if not completely bested them. She suspected Danzō Shimura was a significant step down in difficulty from those two. "I'm not just going to slink back home if you lose, girl," A hissed to her. Sakura didn't reply and stepped forward. There was a large circle of people on top of the Hokage's tower roof, that was now empty except for her and Danzō. There were two halflings with Leaf ninjas on one side and her own forces on the other side. Everyone's shadows flickered on the ground based on the light coming from the Uzumaki family dancing in the skies above. There were reasons other than confidence that Sakura agreed so quickly. If she won, the war was likely over. And if she lost? Well, she'd be dead, but the war wouldn't be lost. As A had said, he'd continue to attack. No promise from the other Kages had been extracted. There was everything to gain and only herself to lose. Yet he knows that too. Does he think my death would demoralize us enough to make a difference? From everything Sakura knew of the man, he'd always been the linchpin of his own plans and organization. So him assuming that same flaw in others wasn't impossible. "I would say it's an honor to face you, but I don't believe in such." It's funny, I don't think I do either, for different reasons. Sakura had always felt like she lacked that warrior spirit that came so naturally to Naruto. That ability to take pride in one's ability to do violence. There was no joy in this fight for her, just brutal necessity, and to save as many lives as she could, and perhaps the relief that one way or another, it would be over soon. Danzō made an amused sound, and for some reason, Sakura felt like he understood what she meant. The battle started very innocuous, with thrown kunai and shurikens. Nobody expected those to do any real damage, but it was to test each other, to see how fast the other could dodge, move and react. Despite herself, Sakura found herself relaxing slightly. Aware she might be overconfident, she couldn't help but note that Danzō wasn't faster than her. And when her fist met his skeleton green Susanoo, he also wasn't stronger than her. All her life, Sakura felt like she'd been trying to punch above her weight class, so facing someone who was close to her level was actually refreshing. Then she froze on the spot, one of her feet being glued to the floor. By enhancing her vision, she saw the outline of a seal she had stepped on. Next, Danzō sent a horizontal blade of pure wind chakra flying over the area, just a few inches above the ground. Sakura only just managed to prevent herself from losing her foot by taking a page out of Tsunade's book and pulling up a part of the floor roof that they were standing on, using it as a shield. By shattering more of the ceiling under her trapped foot, she broke free. Within that time, Danzō had made more hand signs, summoning a small breeze that didn't seem very useful for offensive purposes. Sakura could guess at it though, as Naruto had used a similar trick whenever they sparred. Its purpose would be to check for illusionary images that Sakura used to cast her genjutsus, as they would be unaffected by the winds. With a normal wind, Sakura could fake the movements, but with something so controlled, Danzō would be able to switch the wind's direction faster than Sakura could alter the movements of her illusions to match. And with that, Sakura came to an interesting realization regarding Danzō. He's like me, Sakura thought. Someone who relied on careful planning, misdirection and strategy in order to defeat his opponents rather than raw ability. Someone who was used to fighting those who were either faster or stronger than him. Sakura recalled what she knew about Danzō's abilities. He was probably the most skilled user of Winjutsus outside of Naruto. His Sharingans would make him adapt to illusions, and she wouldn't be surprised if he knew some Genjutsus even discounting his Sharingans. And he had seen her battle with Itachi, so she wouldn't easily be able to use his Sharingans against him. He had a very basic skeleton Susanoo, clearly the weakest Susanoo she'd ever seen. Sakura knew about his Hashirama cell arm, so it was possible he knew some very limited wood style. Beyond that, he knew sealing jutsus and could apply them with a simple touch. Something she knew you'd need to be extremely skilled for. And opposing that, Sakura had her genjutsu images that Danzō knew about and had prepared a counter for, her self-hypnosis, medical jutsus and her super strength. It felt weird, but for once it felt like she was the one who had raw might on her side, and her opponent was the one with the precise toolkit. As Danzō made sure he couldn't be caught by surprise, Sakura kept her illusionary images close to her in the form of drifting Sakura blossoms. Even if he saw them coming, he'd need small instances to break the genjutsus, buying her precious moments. It was the same tactic she had used against Hinata in the Chunin exam so many years ago. Sakura also hadn't forgotten about his Izanagi. Sasuke and Hinata had destroyed most of his Sharingans when they fought him, but he still had 3 remaining. 3 lives. So when Sakura surprised Danzō by disrupting her chakra on a patch of her skin where he was trying to force a seal on her, disrupting his technique, allowing herself a free hit with one of her superpowered punches, she wasn't surprised when his body vanished. When he appeared again, he was already in the process of finishing a sequence of hand signs. Summoning Jutsu! What Danzō summoned most resembled an elephant, but it also had aspects of a tiger, making it a chimera. Range had always been a consistent weakness of hers. When she was stuck in a vortex of sucking winds while bullets of cutting air were flying towards her, there was naught she could do but weather the storm, to keep her footing as she was pulled forward and dodge between the bullets of wind. She still received several cuts, and healing those would have to wait until she wasn't at risk of receiving more. When she got close enough to grab the elephant's snout, she was able to heave and toss the beast back at Danzō, who dispelled it before it hit him. Sakura managed to get in range and used another trick, yet another variant of the illusionary clone technique. It was just light without mass, so by pushing that aspect to its extreme and aiming it at her opponent's head, she could temporarily rob them of their vision. That by itself didn't do it, but she was able to press her slight advantage in melee and force another use of Izanagi. A use that was accompanied by Danzō blowing himself up, but with her fast reaction time and healing, she was resilient enough to take it. Sakura wasn't nearly as good at ninju as Naruto, but you could still vaguely read her opponent's mood. And Danzō didn't feel like he was losing, which Sakura thought was weird since she felt like he was. Danzō brushed his hand against the ground as he moved and laid down a maze of ceiling-based traps for Sakura to avoid, which she did. His Susanoo tried to keep her at bay, but she could handle it. It wasn't anywhere near what Sasuke and Itachi were capable of, little more than skeletal hands that broke every time she punched them. Punching the spirit wheel, it did cause the skin on her hands to suffer some friction burns due to its fast spin, but those could be endured. Danzō used the last Sharingan on his arm to try a kamikaze attack on her, blowing himself up when she came within range of him. She mitigated some of the damage by jumping away in time and again healing the rest, and again. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was simply off about this fight. Then Danzō took a page out of her book and made Genjutsu clone images of himself. For all that Sakura had fought some of the strongest Uchihas before, this was the first time someone had used a Sharingan to copy her techniques. She supposed she should feel flattered. Sakura had a harder time spotting his images than Danzō hers, for while Sakura couldn't adjust the movements to match the wind that Danzō was still conjuring, he could. Again, Sakura had to rely on raw might instead of clever tactics for once. She rushed forward, taking only minimal efforts to avoid the images. Her self-hypnosis gave her some passive protection against minor attempts at fooling her senses. She sidestepped another seal trap on the ground that she only spotted due to her chakra-enhanced eyes. And then she had closed the distance and launched a probing but still deadly strike at Danzō. Contrary to her expectations, her fist ripped right through his middle. Immediately she panicked since nothing ever went that easy. His last Sharingan, Sakura thought. The one in his eye, the Mangekyo. She thought he wouldn't be willing to lose it to Izanagi since he'd been blind afterwards, but if the alternative was losing... And there was still that sense that Danzō just didn't feel like a man who had lost. Danzō gripped her hand, keeping her trapped with her arm buried in his guts. If he blew himself up again from this distance, he'd win. Yet his body didn't disappear, and as the seconds ticked by, the window to use Izanagi was lost, and the mortal wound she had delivered was confirmed in reality. Sakura, not being able to dodge his last one hit, saw Danzō placing a hand over her heart. Yet Sakura felt no true threat from him. Even the seal he placed on her didn't contain any hostile intent. And then the realization struck her. Why his chakra didn't feel desperate. Why she got that odd feeling throughout their fight. He threw it. He meant to lose, Sakura realized. Her eyes widened and Danzō realized the unasked question. He smiled through bloodied lips. He leaned forward until his mouth was just inches from her ear and whispered, "For the leaf, girl. Always for the leaf." And then he slumped against her as all the strength left his body. Sakura stepped back and he fell towards the ground. Silence. The sound of the really big fights, the Uzumaki family, Orochimaru and Hiruzen, they had all stopped. The Edo Tensei was being released with Danzō's death. Minato and Kushina stopped their relentless attack on Naruto when they felt the Edo Tensei being released. "It is done," Minato said as his form began to glow. There was a lot Naruto wanted to say. "I love you, thank you, perhaps even I forgive you." But after the spiritual connection she had formed with her parents during their fight, words felt paltry. Everything that he needed to say had already been conveyed. "Goodbye," Naruto said. And Minato and Kushina, free for these final moments from Danzō's commands, took the opportunity to give their child their first and last hug. "One final gift, dear," Kushina said, and undid the seal binding her piece of Kurama inside of her. When she disappeared alongside Minato, her piece of the bijou merged with the one inside of Naruto, becoming whole again. The influx of power was taxing for Naruto's chakra network, but her body was developed enough that she could handle it. Naruto stayed standing alone in the forest just long enough to watch the last specks of light from her parents' disappearing form, before rushing back towards what she still considered, despite everything she had just experienced, her real family. Sakura looked around. The Leaf's ninjas looked like they were holding their breath. Footsteps came from her own side. Homura, one of the old Konoha elders, rushed forward to confirm the Hokage's death. The remaining Kage, Zabuza and Onoki, seemed to have recovered enough to show up, though both were leaning on subordinates. "The bastard is finally dead. Good," Zabuza said.
Let's finish up here and go home.
The bloodthirst in his voice left little doubt by what he meant by finishing up here. Sakura saw the Leaf's remaining forces preparing to fight or retreat. She couldn't tell which. But if they fought, the Leaf would lose. And if they fled, she could imagine it easily enough. The Leaf village would be declared defunct. Many of its previous members would be left adrift. She suspected pieces of Fire Country would soon be annexed by the other nations. With its military destroyed, the Fire Daimyo would be in no position to refuse. Sakura realized she didn't want that outcome. No, Sakura said. Homura stood up and held the Hokage's head in his hand, taken from Danzō's body, and stared at it. And then, at her. And it was at that point that Sakura realized why Danzō had challenged her to this duel. The only way for the Leaf village to survive was for it to be placed under the leadership of someone else. A Leaf ninja who had opposed Danzō from the start, who wasn't tainted by everything Konoha had done these past months. Someone who had the trust of all the other Kages. Someone with the necessary reputation. Reputation like beating the hated previous Hokage in honorable single combat. Then, in a flash of light and speed that looked like teleporting to those who didn't know better, Naruto arrived with a loud boom. Naruto! Sakura said in relief. Her appearance felt like another rescue. She is stronger than I, and Hokage is supposed to be the strongest in the village, she then said to Homura. Sakura snatched Hokage's head from the elder and pushed it towards her friend's chest, desperately wanting to avoid the outcome she could now see coming. Naruto, you wanted to be Hokage at some point, I never did. Yet Naruto, for once, made no attempt to save her and just looked at the Hokage's head in amusement, noticeably refused to take it off Sakura's hands. Uzumaki was absent at a critical moment. She has never met any of the other Kages before now. They do not know her. And Koharu looked warily at Naruto, as if afraid she would take offense at this or otherwise make an issue. Nothing could be further from the truth, and Naruto's grin threatened to split her face in two once she realized what was being suggested here. This is the most amazing idea I've ever heard. She always did have a flair for theatrics. Sakura thought as she saw Naruto take a knee in front of her. You know you'll always have my support. Koharu and Homura both smiled as if this really was the most idealistic outcome they had hoped for. A young new leader respected by the other villages, backed up by the strongest Jinchuriki in the world. Numbly, Sakura looked at Danzō's corpse. You absolute bastard, she thought, resisting the urge to spit at him. And perhaps for the first time in her life, did exactly what Danzō wanted of her. Sakura stepped back from Naruto, abandoning her attempt to hoist the head onto someone else and put it on her own head. The war is over, she said. Some notable members of Konoha, the joining commander Shikaku, Hiyashi Hyuga, and a handful of others, they came to stand next to her, giving her their implicit support. They saw the writing on the wall, and they knew this was the best chance for their home to survive. The war is over, Shikaku echoed her. The war is over, Gaara said immediately afterwards, stepping forwards, coming to stand next to her, others making room for him out of respect. The others took a few more tense seconds to accept this outcome that didn't end with the Leaf village gone for good. I'm not done until I find my brother, but the war is over, A said. The Leaf village won't be a problem for as long as I live, Monoki grumbled. I can accept this. Zabuza clicked his tongue in annoyance but saw the writing on the wall. I guess I owe you for getting us this far. I won't fight you on this. The words were directed at Sakura. The war is over. Louder this time, the new 6th Hokage yelled, The 4th Great Ninja War is over! And others of both factions echoed the cry. And that's the end of part 44, and pretty much the end of arc 2, I would probably call this. There's a bunch of stuff left to do, and I intend to do it eventually, but I hope you'll all be content with this for a while. Whatever else happens, this is some kind of conclusion of something. Nikes out.